The Prime Minister, who flew out for an on-the-spot briefing and to meet the survivors, has praised the skill and heroism of a three-nation rescue operation. The Queen says she's shocked and saddened and has sent her deepest sympathy to the families of all those who have lost their lives. Many of the passengers were British day trippers or members of the British Armed Forces returning home from Germany with their families. Triona Holden and a BBC camera team were taken on board the stricken ship today by rescuers.
The daylight revealed the full horror of what happened last night. The Herald of Free Enterprise lay on her port side. Rescue ships were at the scene, hoping that more survivors might be found. One salvage tug was carrying a team of British divers who shared that hope. Their vessel pulled up to the exposed keel of the ferry, and making a precarious link-up, they used a ladder to climb onto the vessel. The divers, all professionals who volunteered to help out, are experts at this kind of operation, knowing just how to go about detecting any signs of life. The 11 British divers now working on the ferry face a near impossible task. They say they've already seen 3 bodies, and now they're having to decide which areas of the ferry to start cutting into. They're hoping to find air pockets and possibly survivors. But as one diver put it to me, if anyone has lived this long, it would be a miracle. On board there was evidence everywhere of the sheer scale of the disaster. The duty-free shop was ripped open when the ferry rolled onto her side. Items of passengers' clothing still littered the ferry, lost in the frantic struggle to get to safety as water gushed into the hull. Unused life jackets lay strewn about, an indication of how quickly it all happened. The divers said the angle that the ferry was lying at made their job much more difficult. Inside the vessel, they found themselves walking along what would normally be corridor walls. A stairway hung in mid-air at a 90-degree angle. The ferry's surface was covered in glass. Most windows and portholes were smashed last night by rescuers, desperate to free passengers. Many of them were trapped behind the thick glass, unable to break it and get out. The divers said the glass also hampered their search, cutting through their wetsuits and causing injuries. Despite these problems, they were determined to cover every inch of the ferry, above and below deck, dropping into doorways, leaving no area unchecked. They worked closely together, ensuring they hadn't missed anything. Throughout all the hours they searched, they kept hoping to find someone alive, but instead they found bodies, including those of 2 children. Despite their great experience, they said it had been a harrowing ordeal, one they wouldn't forget. Meanwhile, on the horizon, the other ferries in the Townsend Thoresen fleet were trying to get back to work as normal.
In the darkness and confusion last night, many of the survivors found themselves separated from their loved ones. The horror continued this morning as they wondered what had happened to relatives or friends. Some learnt the worst, but others had the joy of being told their companions were safe. Kate Adey reports now on the efforts last night to save people involving teams from 3 different nations and the efforts today to comfort them.
First, the plates slid gently off the restaurant tables. Then suddenly, the tables, the chairs and people crashed sideways and downwards. The windows were underwater, the water burst in, and the ship was in darkness. The sea was already inside down below, and it was just a matter of seconds as the ferry lurched onto her side. The rescue operation was coordinated within 15 minutes. Tugs and harbour boats raced alongside. RAF helicopters arrived to join the Belgians. Some people had already managed to crawl up onto the ship's side. As the rescue teams arrived, they could see people trapped beneath the windows, which were horizontal. They hacked and smashed the strong glass. They lowered ropes and hauled people out. Below, there was chaos. People clawing and fighting their way up, injured and freezing cold. Survival time in the water was estimated at 20 minutes at most. This was the scene on top of the hull as the divers went to search the flooded compartments. They soon reported seeing bodies. The tug stood by to carry them on shore. As survivors were winched up or taken off by a flotilla of tugs and rescue craft, every available medical team was sent to the area. Hospitals in nearby Bruges and Blankenberg dealt with scores of people with cuts, bruises, hypothermia and shock. The Herald's captain was one of several people in intensive care. He told doctors that he'd heard a crash before his ship capsized. Many of the passengers were families on a day's outing across the channel. They were still finding their seats, heading for the restaurant bars. They were split up and didn't know where their relatives or friends were. It was clear to many who survived that people near them or in the same room or passageway had been lost. One woman said that her husband had made himself a human bridge so that she and her daughter could climb up and across him to safety. She called to him to follow her, but he said, no, there are others here who have to get out. That was the last she saw of him. Others who were separated were luckier.
We were just trying to find things to hang on to because the force of the water was breaking the tables up, and we've got cuts and bruises all around our legs where things were coming and hitting us, you see. And all the chairs were literally just breaking up, and we just had to grab hold of what we could.
How long were you actually in water for?
It could have been about half an hour, that I don't know, because it was so cold, and we didn't bother to really think all we wanted to do was get out. It was so frightening, it really was.
Were there any messages?
Well, my daughter was upstairs with her boyfriend because we split. We said 2 of us would go to dinner first. Yeah. And have all the luggage upstairs, the others would, and then we'd take it in turn. So
they were upstairs?
Yes, we don't know where they were. Yeah, well, we don't know. We don't know.
What's your name?
Maureen Bennett.
You were over for a day trip, were you?
Yes, my daughter paid for it for our wedding anniversary.
Right. Did you come with the son? Sorry.
Yes, we did. Yes, we were. I hope they never ever do that trip again.
Where are you from, Mrs. Bennett?
Crawley in Sussex.
I have good news. I've just heard that she's alive. She's
right, she's alive. She's alive. Teresa is. Teresa.
My God.
My girl and myself were in the restaurant, sitting actually next to the window. The vessel seemed to dip slightly to the left. Things started rolling off tables very gradually at first. Then it became more severe. The lady that was working in the restaurant came flying across the room. And looking outside, we could see the ship was probably at about, 30, 40 degree angle. And the windows outside were actually submerged underwater. We were hanging on in that position for, seemed a long while. It was probably 3 or 4 minutes, enough to make my arms ache. And all of a sudden, I suspect that the water came in, the windows burst, and at that time that the ship actually flipped on its side, sort of almost in an instant. And I think that's when most people went flying about. The water coming in made us all try and float out, but being in the restaurant, we were contained by the glass surrounds. I lost track of my girl then. The only way I got out was by turning somersault underwater and kicking the glass in with my feet. Did the same thing through to the corridor, found myself in the TV room. The ship then seemed to settle. I found myself floating, facing the ceiling of the TV room. The ship settled down. Then it was really in amongst the screaming, trying to get people to settle down and see what else was going to happen. I mean, that was the first thing. The guys that were the crew immediately started trying to get up to windows to smash them out. And that's what happened. The vessel settled like that on its side. The crew smashed some windows and we eventually got out.
And how were you picked up?
A tug took us away. We climbed up a rope and the tug took us away.
And your girlfriend?
I haven't heard yet.
I came up through the water and got onto the ledge. There was a lot of shouting and screaming and everyone saying, "Are you all right? Are you all right?" Everyone was just trying to pull together, I think. Then the lights went out, and I mean, that was, suddenly you're in pitch black darkness in icy water, and you can't see anything then. And that started again, everyone was screaming then at that point. That was frightening.
Were you there on that ledge?
I would say maybe half an hour, 35 minutes.
What did you do during that time?
Oh, I got a little girl there with me. I pulled her up because she was with her mum, and I pulled her over to me out of the water. So I was talking to her mainly because she was so frightened. So I guess it was easy for me then because I'm sort of trying, she was frightened she was going to die. She kept saying, we're going to die, we're going to die. And I think the thing that got me most was she said to me, and I've been ever such a good girl, I've never told any lies, and which was quite sweet. And I said, I'm sure that's right, Claire, I'm sure you're not going to die, really. You know, don't worry, they'll get us out. And that was probably good.
By dawn, the Herald was a sad and unlovely sight. The frantic efforts at rescue virtually over. Even so, efforts were kept up to detect any sign of life, and the huge emergency operation, the military, medical and voluntary services still working hard. As they turned their attention to the consequences of the disaster, the ship herself was being studied for the cause. And in her bows, a huge empty space where her loading doors should have been.
To the families of those who died, expressions of sympathy led by the Queen. She was being kept closely in touch as the scale of the tragedy became clear. This afternoon, the Duke and Duchess of York went to Zeebrugge as her personal representatives to meet some of the survivors. The Prime Minister, too, has been to Belgium. She was flown over the ferry, spoke to survivors, and afterwards talked of a depth of sorrow unmatched in her experience. She promised the rescuers who'd gone to the ship in darkness and worked on in daylight all possible help.
At dawn, the wintry morning sun replaced the searchlights of the rescue ships, revealing the Herald Free Enterprise lying on her side, half submerged, supported by the sandbanks beneath her. Had she rolled in deeper water, she'd have disappeared below the surface, taking with her the bodies of those left behind in the brief and desperate scramble to escape. Less than half a mile from Zeebrugge's two big breakwaters, the sea had overwhelmed her, turning a list to a topple in a matter of seconds, and only the fast, the fit, and the very lucky escaped as the decks beneath their feet rolled into the vertical. During the afternoon, tugs pushed at the hull to prevent her moving again in the rising tide and strong winds. The divers who'd been picking their way through the flooded corridors, compartments, and passenger decks were called off. They had reported with grim confidence that there could be nobody else left alive in the freezing, flooded darkness of her hull, and trying to reach the bodies trapped in her port side was to be too dangerous for the next few hours. In the afternoon, Mrs. Thatcher was brought to the crisis centre in Zeebrugge in a Belgian Army helicopter, first to be briefed by officials on the recovery operation still going on. She disappeared in a sea of journalists and cameramen of many nations as she began the first of many expressions of gratitude to the Belgians for the speed and efficiency of their disaster procedures. Then she sped off on a tour of local hospitals, where survivors still lay, and some of them, uninjured, began to suffer the delayed shock of their escape.
Whole families came, and apparently there were at least 3 people who were in wheelchairs. And of course, they're doing well physically. The attention that they've received from the hospital, they're most grateful for. The hospital is giving them every medical care and every human care they can possibly have. But as one said to me, the thing they're worried about is not so much their pain or their own physical problems. It's what has happened to the rest of the family. And that, I think, is now the greatest problem, isn't it?
Meanwhile, the Duke and Duchess of York arrived in a helicopter of the Queen's flight, which had flown them directly across the Channel from Buckingham Palace to a military base at Zeebrugge. As Mrs. Thatcher and her escort left the first hospital on her itinerary, the royal visitors swept up behind them to take her place, spending a long time talking privately to the injured and the bereaved. At the second hospital in the nearby town of Knokke, Prince Andrew gave his impressions of the stories he'd heard.
Horrific. Listening to people who've been stuck in cafeterias and climbing out.
And glass coming further and further down on their face, and
Bottles falling on top of them. I mean, I think the single greatest saviour, perhaps, was the fact that the tables and chairs were bolted to the floor, which enabled a lot of people to climb out, whereas had they not been bolted to the floor, I don't think there was any way they would have got out. They'd have been crushed under the weight of tables.
And the speed of the air and sea rescue was so incredible. They moved so quickly, and they really were so courageous.
At dusk, the first British ferry boat to leave Zeebrugge since the disaster took aboard her passengers, among them some of the crew of the Herald Free Enterprise, and headed out across the cold water, passing close to the temporary steel tomb of those still lying in the half-sunken ferry that had sailed only a few minutes into its last cross-channel voyage.
Tonight, one day late, but feeling lucky to be alive, the first of the survivors have begun arriving back in Britain. Some of the ferry's crew members are travelling back by sea, but Townsend Thoresen organised a special flight for passengers. At Gatwick Airport, officials cordoned off part of the arrivals area to enable families to be reunited in private.
More than 200 survivors finally arrived back at Gatwick Airport tonight, clearly exhausted and bewildered, more than 26 hours after their ordeal first began. Some were too seriously injured to walk, most appeared to have little but the clothes they were wearing. Few of them paused to talk to the barrage of newsmen. Back on British soil, they faced further questions from police anxious to establish exactly which passengers were now safe and which were still missing. Then at last they went on to a private reunion with the relatives who'd spent so many anxious hours waiting for news.
Other relatives of those who were on the ferry have been waiting for news all day at the Townsend Thoresen offices in Dover, but staff say they have been unable to do much to help. The information they've had from the Belgian authorities has been confusing, and there was no complete passenger list, as there would have been on an airliner.
Dover has today been in a state of shock. Townsend Thoresen ferries slide majestically out of this famous port almost every waking hour of the day. The news that one of their ships, and one of their finest, has inexplicably come to grief has left the Kent town wondering. Local MP Peter REES.
It can't have been weather, because although it was about 4-6, they were on a lee shore, they were coming out, so in fact it was quite calm.
Mr. REES was visiting the local headquarters of Townsend Thoresen, which dominates the west end of the town. Here, relatives and friends, mostly of the crew, have spent an agonizing day waiting for news. Others have been phoning.
No more news at all. I'll be in touch. Should I hear any more? I'm here all night. I'll be in touch. Pleasure. Pleasure. Bye-bye. It's Brian's wife.
Tonight there are unconfirmed reports that 35 crewmen and women may have perished, and the Salvation Army is bracing itself for the task of informing relatives of the dead. But for some there's been no real news. This lady and a friend have heard nothing about 5 people, one of them her son, who were aboard the stricken ferry. Any news would have been welcome.
You just want to know.
That's
right,
it. Yes,
whichever way. Whichever way.
Right.
As long as we know, at least then we can make plans for what's got to happen or what's going to happen. And it is the frustration of not knowing, which is, I think, wearing everybody down a little bit.
Hopefully there won't be anything to go to pieces about, you know, so...
well, let's hope it's good news anyway.
That's right, yes. Hope springs eternal, doesn't it?
The shock of the tragedy was summed up by a crew member who would have sailed yesterday, but for a day off.
We have thought about this before in a ship-turning turtle, as they call it, and just general situations which could occur, but that one's taking it out of everybody. I think nobody was quite prepared for that one. It's, some 4 or 5-year-old child would probably have as much chance as a fully experienced AB at dealing with that sort of situation.
Okay, bye.
Tonight, some of the surviving crew members are back in Dover, but there are those for whom the waiting and uncertainty goes on.
The first of the British people who were involved in the rescue work have also started to arrive back from Zeebrugge. The Royal Navy sent ships and divers, the RAF helicopters, and there were civilians too, among them a group of firemen.
tired out, hungry and very cold, more than 50 Kent and London firemen arrived back at RAF Manston late this afternoon. Using special rescue equipment and heat-seeking cameras, they'd spent hours on board the stricken ferry, hoping to find survivors.
When I was on board, we were unable to locate any survivors at all, regretfully, and all we found was bodies.
How many, in fact?
During the period I was on the ship, we took out 20.
Some of the Royal Navy divers and Army personnel who'd taken part in the operation also arrived back.
It was a pretty horrifying experience. The boat itself had obviously been severely damaged. Not much structural damage, but quite a lot of debris inside, a lot of water, and particular places like the car deck, complete mess, where lorries and cars had just been smashed up one on top of the other.
They'd come home satisfied that everything that could be done in Zeebrugge is being done. But if necessary, they're fully prepared to go back.
At Maidstone, Kent Police in their Casualty Information Bureau have already taken over 2,000 phone calls, but there's often little they can say. Descriptions of the dead and full details of the survivors still aren't coming through from Belgium, and the police say there's still no exhaustive record of passengers who were on the ferry. Only people who actually bought tickets themselves are listed in the company records.
We're still having difficulty getting full details, full and accurate details from our counterparts in Belgium.
Why is that?
Well, quite simply, there of course is the obvious difficulty with the language. There are different organisations over there who are attempting to coordinate work together, but that is still proving difficult, and as yet it is still impossible to get a full list of everybody who is on board.
It's not even certain which of the 415 people listed here as having been on the ship are dead and which are alive. The police say it's likely to be 2 days before they can put out a list, and it's quite possible some of the bodies will never be identified.
And inquiries from relatives and friends of people on the ferry are still being handled by Kent Police. The number is Maidstone, for which the code is 0622, and the number 54321. And there's also a number in Zeebrugge. It's 010 3250 547200. And in West Germany, a special centre has been set up at the British Forces Joint Headquarters at Rheindahlen. It's known that about 100 British servicemen and their families were on the ferry. It's a route they often use for cross-channel trips to their homes in Britain. The centre has been busy with calls from anxious relatives throughout the day.
Wait out and then somebody will come and ask him.
An army spokesman said the servicemen had left 20 cars on the quay at Zeebrugge before boarding the ferry as foot passengers. He appealed to anyone who'd parked there and then taken another ferry to contact them urgently.
Townsend Thoresen have admitted that the disaster happened when a massive amount of water poured in through the front of the ship. But why that happened remains a mystery and a matter for the full inquiry into the tragedy. A key question facing the investigators is the position of the ferry's bow doors when she set sail last night. Our correspondent Christopher Wayne looks at the evidence that has come to light so far.
The vital clue to what may have caused this tragedy can clearly be seen in these pictures of the ship's gaping bow door. This is a photograph of the Herald of Free Enterprise on a normal cross-channel trip. The clamshell doors in the bow are tightly shut. But as the tide dropped today, it revealed that the starboard door was wide open. The question now is that something which happened as a result of the ship turning turtle, or was it the reason for her shipping thousands of tons of water? The Herald of Free Enterprise had set sail heavily laden with juggernaut trucks and cars. Because of the high tide, she was ballasted slightly nose down, which would have put her more at risk if the bow doors were faulty or damaged. Somehow, water flooded in, apparently through the bow doors. There seemed to be two possibilities, collision and door failure. Was there a collision as she sailed out from Zeebrugge, possibly with submerged debris? The captain has spoken of a sort of crash, but other survivors heard nothing, and harbour officials say there's no damage to the sea walls. So was it a failure of the bow doors? As you can see from these pictures of the Herald's sister ship, even if that happened, there's a second pair of hydraulic doors which form a watertight bulkhead. According to the shipping line, failure ought to be virtually impossible.
It sounds a most unusual sort of thing to happen. I mean, it's difficult to conceive how it could happen because, I mean, the doors on these ships are held by massive hydraulic rams, and, you know, they're really massive engineering construction, and they don't just sort of pop open.
Car ferries are really little more than huge barges. Just above the waterline are 2 car decks designed for trucks and cars to drive straight through. If water gets into the car deck, it will flood the entire length of the ship, and the natural roll will push it to one side. The weight steadily increases as more water rushes in. Once that happens, vehicles start to break loose, increasing the list, and eventually the ship will turn turtle. The lives of the survivors were largely saved by the shallow water, because the ship stopped rolling when she hit a sandbank. By then, in the passenger compartment, ceilings had become walls, and corridors deadly shafts, and many of the passengers were seriously injured sliding across the deck. Roll-on, roll-off ships make scores of channel crossings daily. They can load and unload rapidly, not just cars, but heavy trucks and trailers. But for years, experts in marine safety have been pointing out that ro-ro ships can be death traps.
These ships in themselves are inherently very safe indeed. They're very stable, they're easy to operate, they're very comfortable. There's no fears there, but they're also very vulnerable ships. Once something happens, once the hull is breached in such a way that water gets on that wide open car deck, then there's serious trouble to any ro-ro ferry.
So can anything be done to improve the safety features?
Well, the obvious answer is to chop the ship up into small bits, if you like, to put lots of little boxes inside, as traditional merchant ship or passenger ship construction gives you. You make small areas so that if water comes in, it stays where it is. But I'm afraid with a ro-ro, by definition, you can't do that.
Meanwhile, tonight, Townsend Thoresen announced plans to salvage the ship. They hope a ditch can be dug beneath the Herald so that she can be rolled upright and refloated.
Dover Council has established a special fund to help those affected by the disaster. Contributions can be made at any branch of the National Westminster Bank.
And so briefly to the rest of today's news. And miners in South Wales have accepted a 6-day working week for a new pit at Margam. It'll bring about 1,200 jobs to West Glamorgan. Delegates said a sense of responsibility towards the unemployed had led them to accept 6-day production, otherwise they'd have lost the mine. But they deplored management's tactics. The £80 million pit will be ready in about 4 years. Planned production will be twice the national average for fewer hours worked underground. Arthur Scargill, the NUM president, has condemned the South Wales miners for accepting a 6-day week. He said their decision, taken in isolation from other areas, meant South Wales had broken NUM rules and violated union policy.
The Education Secretary, Kenneth Baker, has urged the 2 biggest teachers' unions in England and Wales to think again before starting a series of half-day strikes next week. Mr. Baker told the Conservative Local Government Conference in London that his message for teachers was, don't take it out on the children. He claimed there was no justification for further classroom disruption.
2,000 people have marched through Wolverhampton to protest at the death of a man who was being arrested by the police. The demonstration came 2 weeks after 24-year-old Clinton McKerbin's death. The march was organised by the Wolverhampton Black Community Action Group. There were some scuffles and a policeman was hit by a missile. There were no arrests.
The Danish ship that's carrying dynamite is being kept under tow at a safe distance off the Cornish coast. The plan is that when the weather improves, the Hornestrand's hatches will be opened to ventilate the holds. The crew abandoned her on Tuesday because of a fire on board.
Blizzards are sweeping many parts of the country tonight. Dozens of roads over high ground from Scotland to Devon have been closed. Worst affected areas are the Cotswolds and West Midlands. Police have warned motorists to stay indoors.
And now with a short roundup of the day's main sports news, here's David Icke.
France strengthened their position at the top of the Five Nations Rugby Union Championship when they just held on to beat Scotland in Paris. They won a tremendous match by 28 points to 22, while in Cardiff, Wales beat England 19-12. Scotland couldn't quite recover from a hat-trick of tries from Eric Bonival.
Goes Bonival. Berbizier, Menel, Sella. Misses out Charvet, straight to Blanco up in the line with an electrifying turn of speed out to Bonival, and he's beaten the tackle and is round for his second try. Charvet, and again the try lost, it seems, but Bonneval still goes and makes up for it.
At the Arms Park, penalty kicks kept Wales ahead of England. Then Jonathan Davies hoisted an awkward ball behind the England fullback Marcus Rose. Wales recovered and the big Welsh number 3, Stuart Evans, bulldozed his way through for the game's only try. And England still haven't won in Cardiff since 1963. And England also still without a point after 3 games, but a maximum return for France, and that ensures them at least a share of the championship. They need to beat Ireland to clinch the Grand Slam. In football, Jan Molby's 10th penalty of the season set Liverpool on their way to a 2-0 win over Luton, and that takes them above Everton to the top of the First Division. Colin West scored on his league debut for Chelsea and sent Arsenal to a 1-0 defeat at Stamford Bridge, while Clive Allen improved Tottenham's position when he scored his 40th goal of the season, a penalty to ensure victory over Queen's Park Rangers. Liverpool are 3 points clear, but Everton will regain the leadership if they win at Watford tomorrow. Spurs are up to 4th. Forest beat Oxford with 2 goals from Nigel Clough. In Scotland, Ali McCoist also scored twice for Rangers in the 2-1 win at Falkirk, and that keeps them just ahead of Celtic on goal difference. Celtic won 3-1 at home to Motherwell, while Dundee United and Aberdeen lost ground. They both drew.
And so to the story which dominates the day's news, the loss of the British car ferry, the Herald of Free Enterprise. The bodies of 51 have been found so far, 84 others are still missing, presumed dead. 408 people were saved by rescuers who came from 3 nations. The ferry company can't explain the disaster, the vessel wasn't holed. The Prime Minister has spoken of a night of anguish and promised a full inquiry. And the Queen, deeply shocked and saddened, has sent her sympathy to the families of the dead.
It was the worst shipping disaster the busy English Channel has seen in peacetime, and it was marked by acts of great heroism, sacrifice and sadness too. Out of the wreck of the Herald of Free Enterprise scrambled a man with a baby hanging from his clenched teeth. As the water cascaded in through giant bow doors that were inexplicably opened, a woman disappeared trying to rescue a stranger in a wheelchair. Another woman heard that her daughter, who was missing, was found.
Right, she's alive! She's alive! Teresa is. Teresa.
She and 407 other people survived. 135 did not. And that's the news tonight. Good night.
There'll be an extended news bulletin in This Week, Next Week, tomorrow afternoon, when the programme will be discussing whether there should be tighter safety requirements and changes in the design of roll-on, roll-off car ferries. There'll also be a discussion about next week's teachers' strikes with Education Secretary Kenneth Baker and leading representatives of teachers and parents. This Week, Next Week is tomorrow at 1 o'clock.
Hello to you. Well, as you may well have guessed, winter's not over yet by any means, and this could well be the scene in many places again tomorrow, particularly over central parts, because that's where the snow is just at the moment, running down through Scotland, through central parts of England particularly, and down towards the southeast. Several inches of snow, particularly on the hills, and that's blowing about in the strong winds. The winds, in fact, are now coming in from the southeast, and it's those which is producing the snow, because this front has rain. As it's pushed in across the country, it's come up against the cold southeasterly winds, and that's what's turned the rain to snow. Now, as we go through tonight, the snow is going to edge across into some eastern parts of the country, but back in the west, it's turning to sleet and then rain, and indeed, further west, there are some clearer spells, and they'll be edging into some extreme western parts too. Now, it's going to be a cold night, as you would suspect, over central and eastern parts particularly, a frost and icy patches on the roads with this strong southeasterly wind continuing. Now, as we go through into tomorrow, I think we may find it gradually brightening up on the eastern side, but for many of us, a cold day, a cloudy day. There will be some rain, some sleet and snow about too, more particularly the snow, I think, up over the hills. Well, that's just about it from me.